Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. After the fall of Bashar al-Assad, Syria is trying to rebuild from the ashes. Its new president, Ahmed Al-Sharaa, is courting the US, EU, and neighbors to bring the country back from the brink. But no nation has backed Syria's recovery more visibly than Türkiye, from mediating with the West to restoring infrastructure and now tackling Syria's energy crisis. Ankara has played a pivotal role. Last week, Turkey's energy minister Alparslan Bayraktar announced that Turkey will supply Syria with significant volumes of electricity and natural gas. The agreement was sealed during high-level talks in Istanbul between President Erdogan and Al-Sharaa. Erdogan pledged deeper cooperation in every sector, while also slamming Israel's continued occupation and military actions in Syria. The flurry of diplomacy follows U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with Al-Sharaa in Riyadh earlier this month, where he pledged to lift sanctions, a move the EU says it's ready to follow. So with new leadership in Damascus, support from Ankara, and sanctions starting to fall, is Syria finally turning a corner? For more, joining me now from Amman is Yasser Tabara, one of the co-founders of the Syrian Forum. From Ankara, Ömer Özkızılcık, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and from Dubai, Kate Dorian, a contributing editor at the Middle East Economic Survey. Thanks for joining me. Now, a lot happening in Syria, especially of late. A very important energy deal signed between Syria and Türkiye. Yasser, what does that deal mean? Is there an energy crisis in Syria, and does this deal solve that problem?
There's definitely an energy crisis in Syria. There's been one for the past 15 years. In fact, actually, it probably extended for a couple of more decades even before then. And that is the direct result of a multi-layered sanctioning regime, mostly placed by the United States, reflecting a very problematic relationship between Syria and the United States for decades now. And so what we're witnessing, what we're going through right now is a transformation, really, in the minds of many Syrians. Now, in terms of the Turkish-Syrian energy deal, I think it will resolve part of the problem, a good portion of the problem. It would be more of like an immediate remedial type of measure that will take care of a transitionary period until when the Syrian leadership or those ministries that are responsible within the Syrian government to renovate and do the necessary fixes of some of the major electricity generators in Syria, finish that work. But then, until then, Syria does need an emergency pumping of a lot of electricity in order for it to get to a more reasonable place in terms of energy.
Mm-hmm. Ömer, what do the Turks get out of this deal?
Yeah, I mean, for Turkey, it is a win-win situation. Turkey has a already established relationship in terms of providing electricity to Syria, but also to Iraq. And for instance, in the region of Idlib and the northern Aleppo, Turkey has been providing electricity and the Syrians have been paying for it. And this was something that was in interest of Turkey because it makes Syria more stable, it facilitates daily life, it improves daily living conditions, and it enables the return of Syrian refugees, which is one of the major Turkish political goals in its approach towards Syria. So if there's no electricity, if there's only 2 hours electricity in a city like Aleppo, how can Syrian refugees in Turkey who are accustomed to a proper standard of living go back to their home countries and send their children to school and have a proper, meaningful living standard? So providing Syria electricity is in the best interest of Turkey as well, most notably the Syrian refugees. But not only that, Turkey wants also to be a major player in the energy sector in Syria. There will be more explorations in terms of natural resources on land, on sea in Syria, and Turkey wants to play a role there as well.
Mm-hmm. Kate, this deal was announced after the U.S. announced that it was lifting its sanctions. Is that a coincidence, and are you surprised by the move by U.S. President Donald Trump to lift sanctions?
Yes, I think everybody was taken by surprise the way it happened. But, he was in Saudi Arabia. He had Prince Mohammed bin Salman urging him to do something about Syria. And of course, President of Turkey, Erdogan, was on the call when they all met with Sharaa. So I think the Gulf states particularly want to see stability in Syria. They don't want to see the kind of extremism that can threaten their own security. And I think they see Turkey as maybe supplying some of the, taking part in the reconstruction effort, and for them to be supplying the funds. So I think it's in everybody's interest, and particularly Turkey. You've got a huge Syrian refugee problem. You want that to go away. The Europeans want it to go away. We've seen the Europeans were encouraged by the US move. And I think the US has moved very, very quickly, because we all thought, oh, there are some sanctions that can be removed by executive order, but then there are some that require Congress. But, the office of they've issued this general license 25, which essentially lifts sanctions on Syria and allows, the central bank. There were frozen assets. I mean, there was nothing that Syria could do. But one thing we don't seem to be talking about very much is this is actually an interim government in Syria. You can't really have any deals that will stick unless you have elections. You can't have elections because you've got so many of the population is outside the country or displaced. So I think it's, we're going to see a lot of humanitarian aid going in. But I don't think we're going to see any firm contracts being signed because, as I said, it is an interim government.
Mm-hmm. Yasser, I think Kate touched on an interesting point there. This is an interim government, so she said she doesn't expect to see any long-term deals. Elections, obviously they're talked about, but we haven't really seen any concrete calendar yet. What are your thoughts on that? Will Al-Sharaa want to move to elections as soon as possible to be able to shore up that public support and have the legitimacy of winning an election moving forward, or will he even take part in elections?
I think that part was explicitly addressed by the constitutional declaration and by some of the statements that were made by President Al-Sharaa in terms of what's next and what the transitional period looks like. And the timeline was, I believe, stated to be within more or less 5 years, where a number of benchmarks are to be hit, including the establishment of a transitionary legislative body that all Syrians are waiting to hear news on. Another benchmark was the establishment of the High Commission on Transitional Justice, which was in fact established by presidential decree a couple of weeks ago, or last week even. And there has been, again, an explicit or direct reference, let's just say, to the fact that once we are done with this period, there will be a move towards a more representative form of government. And I think, personally, the sooner the better for someone like President Sharaa, because right now, if you are to survey his popularity index, you'll see that he probably would win by a landslide. But I think everybody understands that there's a lot of work that is needed to be done at this stage, and both in terms of setting up the governance of the country, both nationally and in terms of local administration and things of that nature. So I do want to address the fact that this is a transitional government. Everybody understands that. But in terms of the longer term deals and larger business deals, what we've seen is a serious, at least at the level of discourse, we've seen a serious number of indicators by the American leadership about their serious intent to facilitate larger investments in Syria much sooner than the end of this transitional period. In fact, they tied it to the stability of Syria, and the whole reason that they've decided to lift sanctions is to contribute to a serious economic recovery and an expedited economic recovery. And for that to happen, there has to be large business deals.
In Trump's words, he wants to give Syria a fresh start, and he lifted sanctions. And also as part of that announcement, Omar, he talked about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but also Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan playing an important part in him reaching that decision. Now, after 10 years of basically being on opposite sides, or at least having opposite interests in Syria, are we seeing a convergence of U.S. and Turkish interests in Syria?
Yeah, first of all, let me just second to what Yasser said and underline and re-emphasize that the Syrian people have waited for enough. They have waited for almost 14 years in the civil war area, and the Syrian people should not wait any longer. So there is the need for urgent, big-scale deals to be done. In terms of your question, what we see is a growing Turkish-Saudi collaboration and coordination. So the lifting of sanctions was a symbol or a product of the Turkish joint Saudi efforts towards the United States of America. And actually, we all know that the Israeli side has tried to prevent these sanctions from being lifted. But it appears that Turkey and Saudi Arabia jointly have quite a bit of diplomatic sway over the United States of America. And this is an indication of what these two nations can achieve if they work and coordinate with each other. And we see that since the fall of the Assad regime, that Turkey and Saudi Arabia have come to a similar understanding about the fate of Syria. There is a growing tendency between both nations in the north and south of Syria to coordinate their efforts in the country. And we see that Saudi Arabia will play probably a major role in Syria's economy. The Turkish companies will play a major role. Turkey will also play a major role in Syria's security structure. And this is not a surprise. This is actually a result of a policy decision being made in Ankara. When Bashar al-Assad fell, the Saudi crown prince and his team were quite uncertain about how they should push forward. And it was the Turkish efforts convincing of Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince that enabled them to engage with the Syrian government, with the new Syrian leadership. And since then, we see that the Turkish-Saudi relationship is growing, and there is much more potential to increase and improve this coordination and partnership to a level way beyond Syria. There is also way more room to work together in Lebanon and also in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. So, Kate, sanctions are now lifted, no legal barriers for money to enter Syria. Does that mean the money's going to come pouring in? Is everyone going to come to Syria with dollars in their hand? Or, I mean, what's the risk appetite, especially in the West, in areas like New York, London, Paris, Brussels?
I don't know. I mean, I think when we talk about interim government, I meant government to government kind of deals, but I think private investment, there will be. I think China will probably be one of the first to go in because they're not as risk averse as, say, some of the Western companies. We have had, in the past, Shell has a history there, Total, INA, Gulf Sands, I think, is very interested, which is a UK-based company, is very interested in going back to its Block 26. But you've also got the situation where, the SDF has to be accommodated. I know they've had discussions, the SDF, which is sort of US-backed, and it's, it's Kurdish, mainly Kurdish, with other factions. So, I mean, Sharaa has a big, has a lot to do to sort of bring stability and unite the country. But, the SDF wants a sort of decentralized kind of government, and that's been rejected by Damascus. So I think that is something that you're going to have to sort out, because most of your oil and gas, if you're talking about your oil and gas sort of helping with the reconstruction, it's not really going to do that much because reservoirs have been damaged. You've got pipelines, your refinery is not running. You're relying on Jordan at the moment for gas. Turkey will supply some of the gas. You need to do so much before you can restore production. And Syrian crude oil is rather heavy. It's almost like tar. So it's not going to fetch too much on the market. So you are going to need a lot of these companies to sort of step in. And yes, I remember just before the civil war began, Syria was actually going to have an offshore bid round, which they had to cancel. So I think there is prospects, and I think Turkey has spoken about, the Turkish minister has spoken about opportunities for exploration in Syria because, they're still there. I mean, don't forget, you've got the East Mediterranean now. It's become a big gas hub. You've seen the improved relationship between Turkey and Egypt. Egypt wants to be a sort of East Mediterranean hub, what it is in some way, but there's also another country that's involved in that sort of, gas energy hub in the East Mediterranean, and that's Israel. And you've got that issue to resolve as well, because even though the attacks in the Golan Heights have kind of stopped at the moment, possibly because of pressure from the US, but you do have this very important problem that you're going to have to resolve. What does Israel really want?
That's a good question, Yasser. What does Israel really want from Syria? I mean, it looks like Al-Sharaa has extended an olive branch to Netanyahu, but it looks like Netanyahu is more interested in bombing the olive tree rather than grabbing the branch. So how's that going to play out going forward?
Well, I mean, only Israel knows what Israel wants from Syria and some of the nonsense that has been taking place in the region in general and in Syria in particular by the Israeli government right now. So how this is going to play out, I think American pressure is key in this whole equation. And I think we've seen since President Trump's Gulf visit a serious degrading, if you will, of Israeli aggression on Syrian territories. And I think that one can safely make that correlation between the and even the public statements made by Israeli officials, where prior to the famous Middle East tour, they were extremely escalating and talking about holding territory and even making direct, very aggressive threats towards the Syrian government and using the communities, some of the minority communities in the south, as an excuse to intervene. After the visit, we started hearing a significant sort of downscaling of that rhetoric and of the actual aggression. And so, again, one can safely make the assumption that the Americans and the Israelis are talking about Syria and about how the American administration would like the Israelis to behave when it comes to Syria. Moving forward, the administration in Damascus has been extremely active in terms of diplomatic activities, and they have been very clear that they want to arrive to a point where Syria is transformed from a destabilizing factor in this entire region to more of a stabilizing point. And so I think all of the declarations, the actions that have been taken since really December are all consistent in that direction. There is a very clear focus on the administration in Damascus wanting to control the security situation at a national level. Still, there are tremendous amount of challenges. Less so maybe in the coastal region now than maybe a couple of months before. In the south, in the northeast. And so these are challenges that they are taking serious steps to address. They see them as precursors, for what they're really interested in engaging on, which is economic recovery in Syria. And President Sharaa seems to have a very aggressive economic agenda for Syria, where you can, for example, a week ago, he preempted many ministries in his government and called for a high-level meeting to reform the investment law, for example, in the Syrian regulatory framework, which is a major indication that is his main focus. He has been meeting with a number of high-level business people, He's been soliciting a lot of, business delegations, having high-level contacts with the relevant international organizations and stakeholders. And so that will be the main challenge.
Syria has a new U.S. presidential envoy. Tom Barrack also happens to be the ambassador to Türkiye and a close friend of Donald J. Trump. First, what will having a presidential envoy directly dedicated to Syria mean for the U.S. engagement there? And also, again, I know this kind of repeat of the question I just asked you, but is appointing the ambassador to Turkey also as a presidential envoy to Syria a sign that there's going to be more cooperation with the Turks?
So the special envoy for Syria is a necessity from an American perspective. The American State Department does not consider Syria safe enough for an embassy and an ambassador to Syria due to some potential threats from other non-governmental militant groups, namely ISIS terrorist threat. So the US, but also has to maintain its relationship with Syria, and we know that the embassy in Ankara was quite active in the US-Syria policy, and appointing the American ambassador to Turkey, especially to Syria, just shows how Trump and the Trump administration perceive Syria and Turkey. So for Trump, and he has made this publicly also clear, Turkey is the main power broker in Syria and the main foreign actor in Syria with the biggest area of influence. And Trump wants to work on Syria with Turkey. When Netanyahu came to Washington to gain American support against Turkish security investments in Syria, Trump publicly rebuffed Netanyahu's demand and made clear that he would work with the Turkish president. So this shows that in the coming period, we will see a growing Turkish-American relation and coordination in Syria as well. We have already seen the signs, not only the appointment of the ambassador as special envoy, but there's also the two teams between Turkey and the US in which they engage on the Syria policy. And we still have a pending American withdrawal from Syria. So this withdrawal will ultimately be coordinated with Turkey. And just due to the security risk of a potential withdrawal, the US needs to coordinate with Turkey as well. And in terms of the fate of northeastern Syria and what will happen to the YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, there appears to be also a high level of coordination between Turkey and the United States of America. So in general, what we can say is we have reached an incredible area from Syria, Iranian basically proxy, where Russia was very influential. Now we see Syria transforming from an area of regional conflict into an area of regional collaboration between Ankara, Riyadh, Damascus, and Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. So Ömer just named Ankara and Riyadh as two regional neighbors that are cooperating in Syria. Kate, what are your thoughts on the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Iranians, their view of Syria, and what type of role you expect them to play in the future?
I don't expect that Iran is going to be very welcome in Syria, so I think they're sort of pretty much out of the game. I just wanted to add one thing, on Tom Barrack being appointed as special envoy. Donald Trump has a thing for actually appointing people who are loyalists and who are his friends to positions that he considers to be, strategically important. But anyway, and I think that's where it comes in. But again, also the coordination with Turkey being very important, I think, is that. Yeah, I think the Gulf states, as I said before, I think it is in their interest to see a stable Syria. I mean, at some point, Syria is being seen, I think, even by Ankara as a sort of conduit, as a sort of corridor to Europe. You're going to see a lot of talk about, gas supplies going from the East Mediterranean, potentially from Qatar. I think that's one of the things that was also discussed by the two governments, by Ankara and Damascus, is sort of at some point serving as a corridor. You need stability for that.
Well, here's hoping that Syria has turned a corner and is on its road to recovery. Yasser, Ömer, Kate, thanks for joining me. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, Take care and goodbye.